Hey, welcome to Transform Your Workplace, the show that helps leaders build better companies by getting the people part right. Every week, we sit down with experts, practitioners, and authors who have figured out what actually works at work so you can take real ideas back to your team. This show is brought to you by Xenium HR. Here's the thing about HR and payroll: the demands never stop. Every payroll question seems to bring up 5 more HR questions, and for most companies, all of that work is scattered across vendors who don't talk to each other. That leaves you managing the mess instead of growing your business. Xenium fixes that with the complete HR and payroll solution. They become your team, backed by more than 90 HR, payroll, and benefits experts, so you get the resources of a major corporation without the overhead. And you get to stay focused on what you do best. Learn more at xeniumhr.com. All right, now to today's guest. My guest today is Dr. Sebastian Wernicke, author of the new book, Data Inspired. And if your company has poured money into data and AI, but still feels stuck with small wins, this conversation is definitely for you. And here's some of what you're going to take away. First, why being data-driven usually fails, and it has less to do with technology than with how our brains reject data we disagree with. Second, the difference between steering metrics you can control and success metrics that only look backward, and why confusing the two pushes people to game the system. And third, a surprising warning about AI: we tend to trust it more than the tools we should trust because it's built to please us instead of be right. This episode is a practical, honest conversation about getting real value from data, not just dashboards. And if you get to the end of the conversation and got something out of this episode, do 2 things. Hit the follow button so you never miss our weekly episodes, and share this with someone on your team who'll get value from it. All right, let's get into it. Here's my conversation with Dr. Sebastian Wernicke. Sebastian, it is so good to have you on the show. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you. Pleasure is absolutely mine.
So your new book is called Data Inspired: Building an Organizational Culture of Inquiry for Lasting Transformation. Very rich book. I encourage people to go pick it up. And we're going to cover a lot of different areas about this book. But you start the book by flipping the usual story about data initiatives. So instead of saying they fail, you say they succeed at making organizations very good at staying the same. Now, that's a pretty bold statement. Unpack that for me, and then tell me what most books on data have been getting it all wrong.
Yeah, so I mean, it's of course something where we always hear the headlines, 80% of data projects fail, 90% of AI projects fail. And I think it's a bit more interesting if you unpack what does failure actually mean. And so if you look at various surveys that have been done with executives, what they will tell you is not that they're not getting value out of data, which I think would be the absolute failure, right? Almost everybody's saying, I'm getting modest amount of value out of data, an optimization here and there. Maybe it gives us new ideas. I feel comfortable with my dashboard. But if you ask them, are you scaling this? Are you getting transformative change from data and from AI? Is it deeply affecting your efficiency and your business models? Only about 10% of them will say, yeah, that's us. And everybody else will be saying, well, we've been making this a top priority for years. We've been pouring billions into this, and all we're getting is this bit of incrementalism, these small optimizations. And that's what sort of gave me the idea of, well, if you're not happy with your modest increases, which I understand, you probably just stayed the same, right? And that's what data made you do.
When a leader might pick up this book, I'm sure as you're writing this book, you thought about a certain profile in mind, but what's usually going on inside of their organization that's pulling them towards picking up this book? What are they frustrated with? Why do they feel stuck in the data? Yeah. What makes them realize that their current relationship with data isn't going to get them where they want to actually go?
Well, I think there's a big frustration from having this situation where I think a lot of money is going into these topics, right? They're investing massive amounts, millions, hundreds of millions, billions into technology. They, for years and years, have been saying, this is a top priority for us. We must get these topics right. And then if you feel stuck, I think that just leads you down a path of utter frustration, because the things you've been doing apparently are not working. And yet, and I think this was also motivation for me to create this book. If you look out, where's the resources that I can get to resolve this? I think when it comes to data, you're sort of almost stuck in two segments. There's the segment of the futurism telling you everything will change. Data is going to revolutionize the business. That's not really going to help you with implementation, is it? And then there's, of course, all the technical manuals where it's just very hard to get into it. And then, you have all these frameworks in there and technical diagrams and things. And I just thought, what we really need is just a friendly and readable guide about how to make data work, and we'll make it fun along the way, right? So we'll attach this to some storytelling and just create this book, and that would be my dream feedback. If somebody opens it and says, oh, it said data on the cover, but actually this was a nice journey. I enjoyed this. And that is the goal of the whole thing.
You do a lot of great storytelling in the book to set up some of these ideas. And you open up chapter 1 with Joshua Bell, world-class violinist who played his 3.5 million Stradivarius in a DC subway station, walked away with only $32.17 because almost nobody stopped to listen. And he used this idea to describe how organizations used to treat their data. But today you say that ignorance has largely vanished. Companies are actually listening. They've invested in the technology, declared their ambitions around this data. So why does the experience still fall flat? Where is this data frustration coming from?
I think it's almost like, they stopped and recognized Joshua Bell and the expensive violin, and then what, right? So now they've realized, well, here's this wonderful musician had filled up a whole symphony hall the day before. But now what do I do with that, right? So it's finding that next step. Once you've recognized here's this valuable thing and you've stopped to listen to music, but how do you action that? What's your roadmap now? And what do you do? And so I think it's a bit people being stumped maybe on how to resolve the frustration they're feeling.
You end the opening section with a question that frames the whole book, in my opinion. If failure is not an option, then why are successes so rare? And the numbers are really striking. So there's this chart that I actually have in front of me where you have people considering data and AI as a top priority. 91 out of 100 companies say that data and AI are a top priority. But on the other end of the spectrum, only 10 are delivering meaningful business growth from it. So why the gap? That is such a wide gap. There's a lot in between, of course, that you can probably describe, but why the gap?
Yeah. Well, actually, in recent surveys, it's 99%. And you don't get 99% in a survey. If you ask people, do you like listening to music? You get 98, right? So there's even one person who doesn't like music and still wants to do more stuff with data and AI. It's really incredible how big the priority is. And as I mentioned, I think the gap isn't getting any value out of it. Most people do. But then when you ask further and say, are you a data-driven company? Are you getting transformative change out of data? Then the numbers very quickly drop. And so what I think most companies are stuck with is that they know how to optimize with data. They know how to use data for assertion. So, the dashboard that you want to be green and the bar charts you like to look at, but they don't really know how to create change with data. They have not yet figured out how to create this culture of inquiry, which is in the subtitle of the book, that takes data not as a path to finding an answer, which is, I think, sort of the natural way that we all tend to approach data. We're looking for answers. We want reassurance. But turning it around and saying, well, what if we're wrong all the time? And how can we use data to tell us the next step? How can we be more right? And I think flipping that intuition that you might have about data on its head, that's where that gap is coming from. And I think it's also a source of frustration. Because those 10% of companies that are successful, they have managed to essentially reinvent themselves. And I think reinvention only happens if you have a mindset of, what we're doing right now, it may be good for the moment, but we definitely need to be someone else in a few years from now.
For the modern day business, we're swimming in data with all the tools and technology that we have. There's so much data. Do you feel like some of these organizations are sort of paralyzed by how much data and they just don't know how to use it to make a decision? Like what's really going on here?
Yeah, there's also the feeling, you can never have enough, right? So I think companies have also been amassing data and everything needs to be measured. And which, I mean, of course, it's never wrong to collect the data. But I think what you have to do is you also have to pause for a moment and say, what do I actually hope to achieve here? So just collecting data for its own sake, which I think it sometimes feels like that, right, is not going to lead you to success. So I think whenever somebody says, I'm overwhelmed by the data, what I recommend to them is, well, can we not think about data for a second, but rather tell me about the nature of your business challenges. Tell me about the assumptions that you hold true and where we might use data to prove them wrong and get you to think differently about your business or differently about your business unit. I think that's the valuable step that is so often missing. And it's a hard exercise. And I think it also requires quite a bit of courage because you might find out, well, we have not been doing things as well as we could. Maybe we have been wasting money somewhere. Maybe we've been ignoring this great new insight in the data, like, customer using a product in a certain way, which is a tiny anomaly in the data, but might just give you the idea for the next breakthrough product. And so you need courage and open up the space to do that. And I have a feeling it oftentimes feels more comfortable to just say, okay, before we start into this rather uncomfortable exercise and need to talk also about things like culture and psychological safety, let's just collect more data, and at least we feel like we've done something here. I don't mean to be disrespectful, but it sometimes really does.
No, I think you're right. It feels like having some sort of action in data collection feels like we're doing something meaningful. Yeah. Sebastian, you make a point early on in the book that I want to dig into. You said becoming data driven is a foundational stage, and you note that it's already quite challenging to establish. So before we get to the data inspired, which is the ultimate goal, walk us through what data driven actually means in practice. What does it take for a company to actually get to that space?
Yeah. I think being data-driven at first sounds quite simple. And I like to call this the data deficit theory. I think many companies and many leaders are still operating on an idea that the only thing that's missing to make better decisions is data. And as soon as we will present our people with the right data at the right point in time, they will suddenly start making different decisions, act differently, improve the company for the better. And there's various reasons why that doesn't work. And one of the main reasons, which actually I devote an entire chapter to, is human biology and the way our brains work. So it turns out there's almost 50 years of psychological research that shows when we are presented with data, we don't really react in the way that one would hope. There's a study from actually the year I was born, where they took a bunch of Stanford students who had strong opinions about capital punishment, so death penalty, right? And they showed them a fake study, which was composed of some data sort of giving you arguments for being in favor of capital punishment and some data for giving you arguments to be against that. And the study's goal was simply to find out, does that data change people's minds? And it turns out it actually did, but in exactly the wrong direction. So the people that were pro-capital punishment prior to seeing the data were more pro-capital punishment after seeing the data, and vice versa. And what happened is they looked at this conflicting data, and rather than saying, here's data that's conflicting, I might change my opinion on this, what they did was they more or less implicitly and sometimes explicitly, they discredited the data that disagreed with them. So they had a strong selection bias where they said, here's data that favors my opinion. That's good data. I'm going to go with that. And all the data that disagreed, they would just say, don't trust the source. I don't know. Data seems sketchy. I'm not going to do that. And so I think what that implies is if you want to be data driven in the sense of listening to data and listening to what the data tells you, that's about a lot more than just saying, let's add more data to our company. It's about creating safe spaces where you can actually confront the fact that the data is telling you something different than what you've been doing all along. It's a leadership thing, I think, where leaders, that are oftentimes, I think, prized and rewarded for having strong opinions in the face of contradicting data, feel confident enough or safe enough to say, oh, I was wrong. The thing I was telling everybody to be convinced of for 3 years, I've suddenly been presented with facts that say the opposite. And that should be fine, and leaders should be celebrated for that. But all of these are things that don't happen automatically. So this autopilot assumption, or data deficit theory, I think we need to really get rid of that. But that's hard to do because it's non-intuitive, and we would hope and think that data just changes our minds. And so that's why I think it's so hard to be data-driven. And it's also the reason why data-driven oftentimes is just perceived as a pure technology topic, which,
Right.
I mean, technology is certainly important. You can't do it without, but it's not sufficient to get you there.
So along these same lines, I pull out a nugget out of your book. I'm a huge NBA fan. You bring up Charles Barkley. He's a former NBA basketball star, co-host of Inside in the NBA, which he's very entertaining. But he argues that data analysts are just a bunch of people who have never played the game. And I think he said it a little bit rougher than that. But what do you make of comments like these from skeptics who... skeptics of data who just don't want to use that to make decisions?
Yeah. Well, the full quote is in the book, and I got a bit of mileage out of Charles Barkley. I found that highly entertaining, that episode with Kevin Durant that he did there. Well, I mean, I think the point about not having played the game, I think that's quite accurate observation in many ways. If you approach a business problem just by looking at the data, you won't be very successful, because data, of course, is a very compressed view on reality. So unless you understand the environment you're operating in, the stakeholders, the pressures that they are facing, you can't just hope to analyze the data, come in with a brilliant insight that nobody else has ever had before you, and suddenly everybody will just stand up and clap and change the business. So I think you don't necessarily have to have played the game, but you need to understand the game, in this case, the business, very, very well. So I think in that sense, Charles Barkley, in his very entertaining way, definitely has a point. On the other hand, I mean, if you look at the NBA, every NBA team these days has a large analytics team, and they analyze every single bit what the players are doing. Now, is that good for the game? Yes or no? And we're living in the 3-point shot era.
We got a lot more 3-point shots, I was going to say,
debatable. But I mean, NBA is a business. And so if it wouldn't pay off, and if teams wouldn't feel that they're getting a serious advantage out of that, they wouldn't do all the measuring and analyzing as well, right? So I think there's a bit of truth in there. But at the same time, I think it has to be clear that you need to master data if you want to be successful in sports or business these days.
For organizations, what are the key ways that data is derived? I know in the book you outline a few different ways, but maybe you share that.
You mean derived in the sense of what it can be used for, or?
Yeah. How is data collected and used for?
Oh, yeah. I mean, data is, of course, today so much easier to collect than it used to be, right? If you just think about it, 20 or 30 years ago, if you wanted to have things like location data, you would have to have people running around with clipboards following other people and looking where they go. I think a lot of data today is just collected through sensors, and we all, of course, carry this multi-sensor in our pockets. That's where we get great consumer data, online behavior, but it's also true for machines, of course, where it's just become very, very cheap to stick sensors in various places and basically measure everything. The main challenge then comes with, okay, I'm collecting the data, but how do I bring this together and how do I organize it? Because it's no use if I have the data from 1,000 sensors and nobody knows how to bring these things together again in the end. And so a lot of thought and effort these days goes into how do I actually organize and manage my data. And I know that terms like data management or data governance, they can really clear a room when you say them. But it's become an essential part of dealing with data, because otherwise, there used to be this concept called a data lake, right, where you just store all the data. And for example, if you don't organize your data lake very well, it just becomes what people would call a data swamp. So one of these storage cabinets where you just have all of these numbers, but nobody will ever dare touch them because they're just so disorganized, unlabeled. Nobody knows what to do with them.
You share this graphic in the book that I loved. It was a loop about how a lot of organizations think they would make decisions.
Yes.
You call it the typical but wrong decision-making model. And I think a lot of books would like have some sort of model that would follow something like that.
Yeah.
But you say that nobody actually makes decisions this way. So why do organizations keep using these decision-making models? And what's the true reality about how we use data to make decisions?
So the one in the book, it's like an 8-step model, and it's your standard decision-making model, right? It's sort of understand the situation, lay out the options, evaluate the options, pick the best option, implement the best option. And these models, they just look plausible. They look very clean, of course. But even the textbook that I took this from, by the way, acknowledges that this is not a correct decision-making model. So I think books are starting to catch up on this. Nonetheless, I mean, a clean, nice-looking model is always enticing. But these step-by-step decision-making models, they're in direct conflict about what we currently know about decision-making from science. So there's 2 interesting experiments that I mentioned in the book. One is about a monkey in a Stanford lab, and they gave the monkey a very simple task. So they showed the monkey a dot pattern on a screen, and they asked it to press a button, one of 2 buttons, essentially, depending on where the dots were moving. And what they found was, so they wired up the brain of the monkey to record the signals from the neurons. And what they found was that there was no sequential decision-making. You cannot really locate in the signals a point of decision. Rather, what was happening is that there was this whole noise and jumble of signals. And as the monkey was getting closer to the decision, this noise was over time turning into a signal, and that signal became clearer. A few seconds before the monkey then actually makes the decision, the signal is so clear that the scientists already know which button the monkey is going to press, which is fascinating and scary in its own right. But then the decision is made, you have a clear signal and the monkey presses a button. And this model of you have chaos out of which step by step a signal emerges that becomes clearer. And then there's some point of no return after which the decision isn't reversible. And they show that with a monkey. And then there's this other study where they show that with animal movement, for example. So when you have a herd of animals that's trying to decide where do we go, it's a very interesting parallel. It's also a bit chaotic. And then suddenly there's this inflection point and they will move in one direction. I mean, you always have to be careful about transferring monkey brains and animals to humans and organizations. But to me, it resonated just very strongly with how I perceive both humans and also organizations to be making their decisions. There is no single point at which things are decided. Your typical board meeting is not an 8-step process in which everybody just clearly walks through, let's lay out the options. No, most meetings are decided before the meeting. Most meetings are decided, even if you want a decision, right? Most meetings are decided when you're not even in the room, because you then have to get other people on board and so on. And I think that is very, very important to recognize, because in this 8-step model, it's very clear. There's step 2, 3, and 4. You add some data to that because that will allow you to evaluate your options correctly and to find out what is the best decision. After that, don't worry anymore, and things are being implemented. And if you subscribe to this sort of chaos theory of decision-making, what it means is, of course, that data needs to be inserted into this process very early on. It needs to be communicated to the various stakeholders in certain ways. And even when you think the decision is taken, we've all experienced this, right? That sometimes there's this reversal, things are opened back up again. And So I think that gives you a much better map on how to actually use data to influence decision making and change it. And I think that's ultimately where the value of data comes from. Because if we made the same decisions with data or without data, then we don't need all of that expensive data. So we want to change decisions. We just need to approach it in the right way.
I like what you just said, influence to change it, versus you bring up Goodhart's law in the book where wherever a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. And you use GE as a cautionary tale for this. So for years, they steered towards stable profits, which actually end up masking.
So stable.
Yeah, stable, but it masks deeper problems in their business. Help us understand the line you're trying to draw between success metrics and steering metrics, and how do leaders know when they've jumped to the success metrics?
Yeah. So the difference is the following: a steering metric is a number that is an input number. So it's something that you can directly control. So for example, if I'm in sales, what can I control? I can control how many customers do I call? What's my response time? How fast am I to issue an offer, let's say, if they request one. So these are all things I can measure that will tell me, am I moving in the right direction? Now, the success metric for sales, for example, would be something different, right? It's how many sales did you close, or what's the revenue? Now, the success metrics are always backward looking. That's one of their main properties. And the other property is that you cannot have direct influence on them. So what often happens, though, is that organizations, and of course also leaders, they're measured by their success metrics. So there's a very large temptation to say, I think I should be measuring success I should be steering people by the success metrics. So for example, to incentivize the salesperson by the revenue, by how many sales they closed. And that seems very enticing. And it seems also like something that would make complete sense. But what turns out is that, of course, there's many ways to influence a metric, and there's many ways to game the system. And as soon as you start to conflate the steering and the success metrics, it turns out that there's always a pressure to game the system. And it's not just out of maliciousness or people with bad intentions. It just happens. And many, many studies have shown that when you use success metrics for steering in the long term, it will always drive people and organizations to behave badly. So they start to manage the number, but they forget to manage the business. So you have these situations where the numbers look great, but still the business isn't really going in the way that you would want it to.
In the book, there's another you got a lot of good graphics, but there's one that I loved where it shows on one side of the spectrum, you've got data alone making decisions. And then on the other side is the expert intuition making the decision. And then there's the messy middle, of course. Are there decisions that we make that exist beyond that entire spectrum? Or are there moments where you would use data to make the decision versus the expert? Like, just kind of walk me through how most organizations think about this.
I mean, whenever we're talking about automation or machine learning, so the precursor of AI, that's an example of an entirely data-driven decision.
Yeah.
Because we have told a machine, if X is larger than 3, temperature higher than that, or value, then do the following. Or many organizations also have decision rules, right? Where, for example, an insurance will say, well, if the claim is below $200, don't check it. Just pay it out, because the checking is just going to be much more expensive. So whenever we have decision rules, automation, machine learning, that is entirely data-driven decision-making with all the ups and downsides. And you really need to be careful about managing the downsides, because this codification into automation is essentially, using success metrics to steer. So you need to be quite careful about managing that, but that's where we do that. The pure intuition-led, I think this is something that, of course, we see time and again, right? Where people basically say, I've seen the data, I don't believe it. I'm just going to go with my gut here, which
I've heard that so many times.
Yeah. And, it's not entirely wrong to do that. I think there are areas where we know that human intuition is really great. But those are oftentimes situations where that repeat very often and where people have been in them for a long, long, long time. So, for example, a soccer player might just play the ball in a direction where they can't afterwards explain to you why they did that, or they had no rational reason. They just felt it, right? Or there's examples of firefighters that basically say, this building is getting dangerous. They run out and the building collapses. And they couldn't really explain you why they felt that, but they just felt it. But that is because they had lots and lots and lots of experience of being in the same situation. And in a business context, we don't really have that when we make big decisions. I mean, any business situation, any strategic, are we entering the market or not? Should we launch the product or not? You've not been in this situation 1,000 times or for 10,000 hours. So that's where you need to find the middle ground. So you don't have enough data to make an entirely data-driven decision. So statistics will not tell you which way to go. At the same time, you don't want to rely on your intuition here. And you especially don't want to do that because there's actually some biases that will tell you, oh, your intuition is great, when in fact it isn't. We're so wired to believe our intuition is good. It's not. And that is the mechanism that some companies, such as Netflix, which I mentioned as a prominent example, have really perfected and tried to figure out. It's how do we balance the data input and the expert intuition with each other. And the way that Netflix does it, for example, is that they will provide a lot of data to their decision makers because they just observe all the viewers. So if you design a show in a certain way, they will more or less know what that's going to do to the audience. But sort of against that, they pair that with a lot of decision-making powers for the decision makers. And the decision makers are even, to some extent, encouraged and incentivized to decide against the data if they have a very, very strong gut feeling against it. And that doesn't mean that they can decide arbitrarily, but they can make informed choices and they can make calculated risks. And I think that is a very, very good sweet spot that they found. But of course, also one that requires a lot of courage from an organization, because you're essentially saying, I'm going to let people decide against all of this valuable data. And the people also have to decide, I saw the data. I still believed in this other thing. I'm going to put myself behind it. And of course, there's always a temptation to go down the path that data showed you. And I think that's where we're, already getting into that territory between what's data driven and what's data inspired. There's always the temptation to do what the data tells you because it feels safe. And you can always say, the data told me so. I saw that in the data. But to be really transformative, you need that risk taking. And you need to be able to say, well, the data said so. I decided the other way. And by the way, I was willing to be wrong. And sometimes I will be wrong, but it's going to drive us ahead over the years to come.
I think this is a perfect segue into AI, because I think generative AI tools, even though most people listening probably don't know how machine learning AI actually work, they're using it because it's now like so ubiquitous. And we're using it to make decisions in a lot of cases. And I think the temptation to go down that road of just using or making a decision based on what the AI is giving you, I think it's there. It's real. I've seen people do it. What are some pros and cons to some of these tools from your perspective? I know you probably have a lot to say on this.
Well, I mean, the fascinating thing is, so I differentiate in the book very clearly between machine learning and AI. And I say machine learning is using data to train an algorithm, a machine, towards a very, very specific goal. And AI, I use in the same sense as generative AI. So we took this machine, we fed it all this language, all this data. We didn't really have a goal. I mean, the way that most AI today is trained is basically by saying, we want output that pleases the user. We want output that we're happy with, but we don't really go beyond that much. And so an interesting thing is happening. Machine learning, because it's based very much on statistics and defining clear goals, is actually often a better decision maker than humans. So we know this, for example, from cancer research, right? A machine that has seen tens of thousands of images of skin and been told, this is an example of problematic, that could be a tumor. At some point, it just becomes better than the human at recognizing it. And still, from a psychological point, if you look at studies that measure the trust in machine learning, people will always say, this machine I don't really trust its decision making. I'd rather have a human, at least make the decision or look over it once more, get a second opinion. That's a natural reaction, even if you prove to them that the machine overall is a much better decision maker. We have the same thing with self-driving cars, for example, where it's already proven they're better than human drivers, but still, there's the occasional accident that the machine causes, and that causes us to back off immediately. Now with AI, because it's trained on pleasing us, the interesting thing is it's much less reliable than machine learning, but our implicit trust is so much higher. So we're wired to trust the type of automated decision-making that's actually not trustworthy, and to distrust the one that actually is. So human brains are weird that way, I guess. But that's the huge danger, of course, of AI, that we use for decision-making what we trust, even though we shouldn't. And that is a path you have to be very careful about walking down.
That's a good distinction, because I think with AI, because it has this like human tone element where we lean into trust it, and there's data behind it, but not quite like machine learning. So thanks for highlighting that. I appreciate that.
Tells you you're brilliant, while machine learning tells you you're wrong. I mean, of course you would trust the one that tells you you're brilliant.
So true. So because of a lot of these tools, we're swimming in data, and it's fatiguing. I mean, reports, dashboards, AI summaries. I mean, more things that we can use than we can act on all of it. And for a lot of leaders, we're fatigued by it, but how do we actually get inspired by the data? You talk about storytelling, and data can actually have a soul behind it. Maybe talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think the aspect that data has a soul, it's just so important to me, because I think whenever we say data, I was really afraid to put the word even on the book cover, thinking, what's it going to do to sales? Because we immediately imagine large tables of numbers. It's going to get boring. It's going to get nerdy. But if you look at the outside world, I mean, data has lots of fascinating opportunities and possibilities. It does enable AI, but it also, there's art created with data. There is innovation driven by data. There's data journalism, one of the most fascinating ways to learn about the world. And so I think we need to recognize that data isn't just there to constrain us and to set us on this path that is basically foretold, right? And we cannot go left and right because the data just says go there. I think we have to realize that data is, I think, a language of possibility. If you look deeper into these large and complex data sets, and you don't try to find the mainstream, what it's telling you, but you look at the outliers, you look at the anomalies, there's fascinating new ideas that you can find and generate. And I think those aspects of data is something that we need to embrace much, much more. In the book, I distinguish between these two almost archetypes, right? Where I say, well, on the one hand, you can be a dashboard director, which is this person that looks to data for the answers and says, I want the dashboard to be green. If it's red, I want to be able to drill down and to know what's going wrong. And then, I'll tell people what to do. And then there's the data divers who say, no, I'm actually not looking to data for the answers. I'm looking to find new, interesting questions. I want to find the stuff in the data that I don't understand, to dig deeper and to investigate further and to maybe find out, okay, how could I maybe gather additional data? What else could I look at? How can I connect different data sets across my organization to find new insights? And I think that's where data comes alive, and where it's all about, it has a soul, and it gives us inspiring ideas, and it drives innovation. And to be clear, of course, we also need the dashboard director to run the business for operations, for efficiency, but we need to add the data diver aspect to it as well. And I think both of them together, balancing each other, that's what makes an organization successful these days.
Sebastian, up to this point, we've talked about the first 4 parts of the book. What we haven't covered is part 5 of the book, the Toolbox, which is where I want to encourage people to go get the book, because this is where the rubber meets the road at the end of the day. You got workshop formats, methods, checklists, the actual work, doing the work of transformation. So give us a little peek into what's in this section. What tools do you want to just kind of highlight?
So I think there's sort of two main types of tools. A couple of these chapters are simply checklists that I've been developing over the 20 years that I've been working with organizations. to implement data projects. So whenever I noticed, something didn't quite work out, there's something we should have taken care of, there's something we just forgot or overlooked, it was put on the list. And so over these 20 years, it's never done, but I think these lists, they have evolved to a point where they hopefully can be quite useful. And they're checklists, so they don't prescribe on how to do it. But I think it's just useful, for example, when you start a data project to say, have I really understood the problem? And there's an entire checklist to make sure that you have not just the problem itself, but also the stakeholders, the space you're operating in. And I'm using this myself every day, and I just find it incredibly useful. So I thought it would be great to share that. And there's also one on data literacy, for example. The other sort of format that's in that toolbox is workshop formats, because what I found is that if you want to be successful with data, you have to bring together a lot of different stakeholders. It's never just a technology project. It's never just a business project. But in most organizations, I think we know these people don't always talk to each other, and they're not used to talking to each other. So we had to spend quite some time figuring out what's a good way to do that? What's a good way to get together a leadership team and talk about data in a productive way so that you can design a strategy? What's a good way to get together the technology person, the product person, the marketing person, and really think together through a project, a use case that they want to implement? And over time, these formats, again, it's experience where I found what worked and what didn't. And I thought it would just be very valuable to share that and to allow other people to conduct these formats, because I really believe in them, and they're tried and tested.
I want to end with this, Sebastian. You have an author's note at the very end. You write about a seductive fallacy in business literature, the case study trap, where an approach is validated just because a successful companies use it. And you say real breakthrough success comes from first principles, judgment, and the courage to make decisions that may seem wrong to those following yesterday's playbook. So for leaders listening, what does that actually look like in practice?
I think it's basically a fancy version of saying sometimes you need to slow down to speed up. I mean, I completely realize, I'm a partner myself in a consultancy, right? So I know about operative pressures and the 100 emails coming in and the 20 directions you're being pulled. So I get that, and I understand that, and I also get that it's very enticing to then just say, okay, what's the recipe here? I don't want to dive deep now. I don't want to make a decision. I don't want to understand something. I just want to know where to go. But when it comes to really affecting transformative change with data, so talking not about the operational day-to-day, the monthly, the quarterly, but really saying, how are these technologies going to affect our business and turn it around in 3 years and 5 years? And of course, that discussion is now all the more relevant with AI. Then I think you have to pause, and you have to create that space, and you have to find, or at least, look for these first principles and basically say, what is it that we really believe in? How do we understand not just the challenges that we have? Everybody will be able to list those, but the nature of those challenges. And so I think sometimes it's just worthwhile to say, I know it's going to be painful, and I have the feeling I don't have time for any of this, but you have to engage on a deeper level with these things. And I think the most successful case studies that I've been part of, by the way, were the ones that didn't really have a clear answer. I mean, if you look at the standard like Harvard business case format, most of them, of course, have a real story behind them. So you will know what the leader did in that situation. But that's not really what it's about. It's not about saying, here was the right solution. What's really interesting is the discussion that happens, where everybody will tell you, well, I would have reacted this way. I would have reacted that way. I think that quickly shows you, where do I stand in all of this? What do I believe in? And I think every leader should have the ability and should take the time to find that out, what they stand for.
Sebastian, thank you so much for coming on. Your book is out. It's called Data Inspired, Building an Organizational Culture of Inquiry for Lasting Transformation. Where do you want to point people to? Anything to plug?
Yeah, I mean, besides the book, of course, always happy to connect on LinkedIn. That's where I am. That's where I post. That's where I love to engage. And if you want to find out more, you can also visit datainspired.org. You'll learn a bit more about the book, find some additional resources, and also a way to contact me. So always feel free to reach out.
My guest today has been Dr. Sebastian Wernicke. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks. Absolute pleasure.
Hey, thanks so much for tuning in for today's episode of Transform Your Workplace. The content on this show is strictly for general information and educational purposes only, so that you can go transform your workplace in a positive way. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed on the show are the guest's own and don't represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of either Xenium HR, the sponsor of the show, or me, the host, Brandon Laws. Additionally, Xenium HR or myself, Brandon Laws, doesn't endorse any guest, their business, or any organization they represent, so discretion is advised. We encourage you to work with a trusted advisor to find a custom approach that fits your organization's needs. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode.